welcome back YouTube to another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast. Tonight's episode we will be beginning a three-part series on the introduction to the Elder Futhark version of the runes from Norse traditional spirituality. So I'll go ahead and let you, Brian, go ahead and, sort of set the stage.
Cool, thank you very much. Well, first off, I think there's a few misconceptions about the runes that we need to address. The first being, obviously, is that much of academia and even modern neo-pagans and heathens believe that the runes are, one, just a form of writing, and that, two, that came from whenever, the Greeks, the Romans, they all brought their influence up into the northern Germanic territories. There's quite a bit of evidence showing why that isn't true. And the first one I'd like to point out is right in the name. It's Elder Futhark. So Futhark refers to the first six runes. So Fehu, Uruz, Thurisaz, Ansuz, Raido, and Kennaz. So no other alphabet in the world starts in that same order. And if you were to look at the Italian, the Greek alphabet, all these, it's all alpha, beta, and then they continue on. So they all have the same order, whereas the Elder Futhark, totally different order. The Germanic people tend to be very practical people. So if they were adopting an alphabet, it's more than likely they would have kept that same order. There's really no need to rearrange it. So we can understand there that obviously these are something that came from a lot further back in history than obviously just when the Romans came there. That's also kind of built on this assumption that the Germanic tribes were just these barbarians, that there's no way they could have come up with, symbolism and things like that on their own without their Roman conquerors. So that's another kind of assumption that has been put out there in history to make our ancestors seem like they were just these dumb barbarians, which, if you actually look at history and some of the things that they've done, we can see that that's just utter bullshit. And secondly, this theory kind of comes from what has been accepted in academia as fact for a couple hundred years now, which is what is known as the Indo-European migration theory. And this is a theory based that operates from the understanding that there was an Aryan civilization that developed somewhere along the Russian steppes, and that they then, around 7,000 years ago, started to leave the steppe and go down and invade Europe, India, and all these other places, and that over the period of a few hundred years to a few thousand years, that they actually imposed that not only their language, but their religion, their culture, all these other things. Well, this theory has been disproven through what is known as the Paleolithic continuity paradigm. And the difference between a theory and a paradigm is a theory is a hypothesis that someone puts out there, usually coming from a single field. A paradigm, on the other hand, is something that is an aggregation of knowledge coming from many different fields of study that are all working individually of each other, but their results are then confirming the same information. So the Paleolithic continuity paradigm goes to the effect that mankind started in Africa and then migrated up. And around 50,000 years ago, the first Indo-Europeans coming out of Africa then settled in Europe and spread around. And the reason that their languages differ is because of ice ages that came in. So there was, with the Swiss Alps and everything, that then separated the Germanic and the Celtic tribes. So that's why we can see a lot of similar roots in the language, in the linguistics, but they also have their own variations of that. And that's because that developed slowly over time. Whereas with the Indo-European migration theory, the assumption is that all that language and culture and religion then all came off of the Russian steppe. Now, there was an Aryan culture. That's definitely something to be seen. And they did invade, but they went east. The European indigenous people, they've been there for a very long time, and their languages developed off of the language and the belief systems that they had originally brought out of Africa. So with the Proto-Indo-European language. So this is something, it's a huge subject, so I encourage everybody to look into it, but that's a very quick, brief thing. So when we can take this into account, we can see that a lot of you can look through language and analyze it and see that a lot of the root seed sounds and everything, those are very similar throughout the cultures, but they also are very different than other linguistic branches. They're different than Sanskrit and things that languages we see come from the Middle East and things like that. So they are definitely their own branch of languages. And when we can see a lot of these seed sounds, we can trace them all the way back to, and still even to this modern day in some of the African languages, and they have the same seed sound that still has the same meaning when you look across all the different cultures. So we can tell it's something that's very, very old. And one of the big misconceptions about runes, as I said before, is that they're only a system of writing, where the runes are really phonetic. They are about sound. So this is something that we can trace back a long time, because they may not have started actually carving images of the runes until later on, those seed sounds were still in use for tens of thousands of years.
Right.
And then another thing that I wanted to hit on here is the writings of Tacitus. If you don't know who Tacitus is, he's a Roman historian. So being that he's written, history's written by the victors, you do want to read his work with a grain of salt and keep in mind that he was a Roman trying to make these lands look like they were good for conquest and things like this. But one of the things that Tacitus writes about is how the men of the tribe were constantly practicing in divination. And they would take the bough off a stick off of a fruit tree, and they would carve they would carve symbols into them, and then they would cast them and then divine based off of how those fell. And he never actually specifically calls them runes, but when you actually start looking at how to operate and work with the runes, we can really, kind of see this is obviously what he was talking about. So, these are, things that, if we look at them, you've really got to study it in a broad picture and pull a lot of this different information together. But when you start doing that, you can recognize that these are something very, very special and very unique to, the Germanic tribes. So we can see when we start to look at all these different fields of study and looking deeper into these, we can notice that the accepted version of what academia has been telling us about the runes isn't correct, that there's something much deeper and much richer to them. And what a lot of people don't realize about the runes, and this is specifically why I also use the Elder Futhark, which is the older Futhark. There are also younger versions or newer versions of the rune known as the younger Futhark, but those were incorporated later. So this is why I operate with the Elder Futhark, because it's older. But when we can see how the Elder Futhark is designed, we can actually notice that it is set up as an initiation. So you can see that there are 24 runes, and each one of them is split up into 3 sets of 8. The first one, which we'll be talking about tonight, deals with the physical level. The second set of 8 deals with the psychological and emotional level, and the third set deals with the spiritual level. So as you work your way through each rune, and then through each level of them, you start becoming a true human being, an aware human being that is in touch with yourself and those around you. And by the time you get to the end of the Elder Futhark, you will then have mastered the essence of those runes and the lessons that they have to teach, so you can then be a functioning member of the tribe. So a bit long-winded, but quick little kind of preface onto why we use the Elder Futhark, what are some of the false assumptions about it. And again, I encourage people to definitely go look into things like the Paleolithic continuity paradigm, because it will radically shift your perspective on how European culture, European paganism came into development.
Right. And yes, I mean, I appreciate that you're going in depth here. On this podcast, we really try to blend a balance of surface level, entry level stuff, but also stuff for people that are willing to go into that, in the deeper waters there, so to speak. And, historical significance and context is extremely important in this topic to fully understanding from a holistic perspective, exactly what we're talking about here. But to sort of reel it back into a more introductory note here, essentially, you want to just think about what language is on its own. Forget about the runes or the language that we speak. If you go way back in time, there was no written languages. It did begin as sounds, like Brian mentioned earlier about those seed sounds. This is how our communication methods went from probably, body language, facial expressions, and hand gestures and things like that, to making different sounds and then associating meanings with those. And then as that science continued to develop further and further, it began, forming into symbols that are associated with those sounds and their meanings altogether. So, like Brian said, the language that we use is partially based on the Latin and Greek, which is the alphabet, the alphabet, and there's a lot of continuity with the way that alphabet is structured. But this system that we're introducing here, the runes, is very different in that essentially it became an alphabet and a language after. It started as a spiritual tapestry, essentially. So Brian, as Brian mentioned, it's broken up into 8 sections that each set of 8 sort of corresponds to a different level of selfhood. So in lots of occult traditions, there's sort of the higher self, the lower self, and then the synthesis of the two. This is the Trinity, essentially. So you can look at mind, body, and spirit, where much like the Star of David, the mind is the intersection between the higher and lower realms. And so first you manifest physically, so you have to, just as a baby, you need to take care of your basic needs. You just got to make sure that your physical needs are being met, and then think about the progression through life as you're developing and maturing. The next stage is sort of more just learning how to master and control your emotions, your thoughts, all that next layer there. And then once you become a fully formed adult, that's really when you begin to really start contemplating your place in the world, things of a spiritual nature. So you can see how this is a very linear, reasonable sort of progression through. So again, just think of it as in terms of the sounds and the actual energetic charge that they hold as a force of creation. So when you talk about language, how do you spell? You create words through spelling, and a spell by definition is a spoken phrase that is influencing the very nature of reality. Almost all of the old religious or spiritual teachings of the creation process, reality was spoken into existence, and everything is a form of vibration, and so being able to speak and create through language is actually one of our most divine abilities. So this is the runes are so much more than just these quaint little symbols with meanings or something. I mean, it goes really, really deep into the very fabric and nature of the universe.
So I also want to mention that, the runes, what they really are, they are elemental forces of nature that have both power to create and destroy. And we are introducing them intellectually here, but I encourage people that you have to take it beyond just thinking about it intellectually. These are something that, if you really want to understand their essence, you need to work with them personally and spend time and devotion and dedication getting to know each one of these runes. And that is the way you truly come to understand how powerful they really are. I just want to add that quick bit.
No, that's an excellent point. Yeah, this is not something to be taken lightly. And if you're interested, again, like you said it perfectly, that we're sort of introducing a logical, like intellectual idea about what these are, but you can go into each one and research them on your own, and then the more important thing is actually using them. And if you're interested in learning how to do that as well, again, consider downloading our free initiation package, where we actually have a section in there that's all about learning how to invoke and enchant the runes in a way that's going to allow you to work with them in a very realistic way, rather than, say, an academic way, right? So
Yes.
again, we're just trying to get these ideas across and just show you what the meaning of each one is. And again, keep in mind, as we're going through an order, it is a system that begins at the beginning and it goes through in a particular order, because each one will build upon the last as you're moving through the steps of progression. So, Brian, would you like to begin with the very first rune, Fehu?
Sure. So this is a rune that, if those of you who are familiar with our work, we've mentioned this rune more than a few times. And Fehu, its translation is to cattle, but it can also be looked at, that's where we get our word feet. So the Germanic people, and during the Ice Age, cattle were what they really used as their resource, because not only could it provide clothing and food and milk and cheese, and all these other resources, you could use the bones, really the whole part of the animal. So instead of trading money and things, like gold and silver, they would trade cattle. So depending on how many cattle you had, that's how wealthy you were. Because if there was a very cold winter and you had a lot of cattle, well, your family was wealthy. You had what you needed. And the Romans, Tacitus writes about this, of how the Germanic people didn't really have a use of money in the same sense the Romans did. They were just interested in cattle. If you gave them a silver or golden goblet, they would look at it like, oh yeah, it's shiny, and then they would put it up on the shelf and continue using their wood mug. So I mean, they're very, very practical. So when we can look at this, we can see how important being able to have resources are. That not only do you need to be able to, feed yourself, but clothe yourself and be able to build shelter. And this is a rune for all sorts of resources. Now, in the modern day, it can especially reference to money, because in our society, money is the medium of exchange that we use to get the resources that we need. So it can also be seen that way, but it's also being able to have resources of anything. For example, like your car breaks down and you happen to have a neighbor that's a really great mechanic and they're willing to help you work on it. That's a resource that you have. So these are the things that Fehu deals with. And in the physical reality field, you have to start by being able to bring in and manage resources, or else you're not going to be able to make it long enough to learn those other runes.
Exactly. And you can kind of really just think of any sort of material resources as Fehu. So money in the modern day is just a means of getting more Fehu or different Fehu. So,
right.
And I also found this to be really interesting, is that the reason that they used cattle as a medium of exchange is because it had universal value. If I have some random trinket, well, not everybody's going to want that. But the thing with that, because the cattle, the aurochs, represented such a centralized form of value of everything that you needed to survive in life in the material, it had value to every single person. So it was a sort of a monetary medium of exchange, if you will. I just thought that was a really interesting way of looking at that, even though it was such a primitive thing. The basic philosophy and principles of economics are pretty much there, because there's a lot of natural law regarding economics and the way things work, as just far as value, the exchange of energy and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And with Fehu, we can also see that it's a rune associated with the goddess Freya, who's a goddess of fertility, of material things, material pleasures, joy, but also a lot of wisdom. So we can see the connection between like the Venus energy, the Freya energy, and being able to have those material things and enjoy things in life. But we can also look at it as a rune that's very much connected with Mother Earth herself, because what Mother Earth is a provider, a nurturer, gives us those resources that we need. And even looking at it in our human species, what is the first thing a child has to have when it's brought into this world from the mother? It needs the milk. It needs that resource, that nourishment, in order to be able to bring in energy and then continue to grow.
Right.
So this is where it starts.
Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly.
Grows out.
Mm-hmm. So
So the next one we're going to look at in order, obviously, is Uruz. So the word Uruz relates to the ancient Aurochs, which was basically a Northern European bison, which is now extinct. But as we mentioned in Fehu, this was that medium of exchange that they were using, for Fehu. But what this represents is really strength. And this can be strength of many forms, including sexual or just having that fierceness as a warrior, because the Aurochs was actually, just think of the size of a modern day cow, or like this thing was monstrous. What would you say, about 10 feet, 6 feet tall?
Usually about 6 foot at their shoulder. So they're just extremely massive, powerful creatures. And just as a quick little add-in here, the Aurochs was actually around before cattle. So this was something that, working with this theory, we can see that the Uruz rune was probably actually there first, but then Fehu eventually was then added in as we domesticated that wild Aurochs and then turned it into what became cattle.
Yeah, very good point there. So again, just imagine this 6 foot tall just beast that is very fierce and strong. Just think about a charging bull. That Taurus energy in the astrological perspective is very much kind of in relation to that. Very strong, and because it was needed for survival, this was a way for tribe members to cooperate, because one person was not going to take this thing down. It took essentially all the warriors in the tribe, and they were putting their life on the line, because if they didn't, all the people would starve themselves, the women, the children, and everything. So before they were this conquering, nation-based, going out and Viking, this was what the warrior, being a warrior, was to them, is being a fierce hunter that was willing to be fearless and go into battle for that need. As I mentioned, this can also relate to sexual energy as well. So it's sort of like this driving. It's very masculine, very like kind of testosterone sort of energy that you could consider in that. So you could use this for bolstering your own willpower and resolve and things like that. But you can also use it if you're wanting to strengthen your sexual potency, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, like if men work with this rune a lot, you can sometimes notice that your sexual energy gets, can get very pent up. So you want to
don't overdo it, boys and girls.
But just like a bull, when you think about this energy, not only is it very strong, but it's very grounded. You imagine a bull digging into charge.
Right.
We actually look at the Uruz rune. What does a bull do when it puts its horns down? It turns them down, and then we have the Uruz rune. So it's this bull with all this grounded, very strong, masculine energy, this intense energy charging forward. This is the essence of Uruz, and you need that strength in life in order to be able to move forward, to continue to push forward through whatever challenges may be there.
Yeah, you could look at this again from the ancient perspective. The first thing you need is that Fehu to begin growing as a person. But think about the infant mortality rate back then. What did you need to survive from beyond that mother's milk? Is you got to be strong. So you're building that and building up your strength. That's the next. Again, remember, this is all in progression.
Excellent point.
So would you like to introduce Thurisaz?
Sure. Yeah, so another rune that, if you're familiar with our work, you'll have heard us talk about, and this is one of my personal favorite runes to work with because of what it entitles and deals with. So the translation for Thurisaz is giant or thorn. So this is the rune associated with Thor, and even when you look at the Thurisaz rune, it looks like a stem with a thorn on it. So this is the rune that is all about boundaries, and sovereignty. So recognizing where you begin, where you end, what is yours and what isn't. So you have to understand these boundaries, and so many issues that we have play out in our life all come back down to boundaries issues. So this is a rune that not only do I work with a lot myself, but for clients and students that work with me probably one of the runes that I really have them spend time on and delve deeply into, because it's so important. And I think an interesting thing to notice about looking at it from the thorn perspective is that a thorn will only hurt you if you are violating its boundaries. And the amount of pain that you experience goes back to how much pressure you are placing on that. So if you're going in and violating its boundaries in a really intense way, well, that thorn's go to penetrate deeper. It's go to hurt more. So I think that's an excellent lesson we can observe from looking at nature.
And what a very beautiful metaphor in general for thinking about the rules of sovereignty and natural law, in that cause and effect that's coming. But when you're the one violating, you can feel that pain and be like, why are you doing this? But essentially, subconsciously, we don't even realize that we're doing it to ourselves, because we're the ones that are out of line and violating. So really, I like to look at Thurisaz as the rune of sovereignty, basically. Of course, there are other aspects to sovereignty, but this is kind of the really big one, especially in the context of this world where mind control and sorcery are happening on a daily basis on a mass scale, which are all about trauma and how that disrupts your sense of self. And usually people will knee-jerk compensate by either extending their boundaries out too far and encroaching on other people's boundaries, or shrink it in to the point that you are a doormat and have absolutely no self-respect. And we do talk about this concept a lot as well. So this is definitely one of the most important ones, considering the energetic climate that we are moving through on a daily basis. It's just this one of the you need to be working on all the time to keep calibrated, keep yourself calibrated.
Absolutely. I can't recommend people working with this rune enough. It extremely powerful rune. And keep in mind that when you start working with the runes, they are energies of transformation. So when you start working with them, you're going to feel some transformation. I've seen this play out not only in my own experience, but in students' experience as well, that if they have situations or people in their life, I'll tell them to work with Thurisaz, and all of a sudden, people will just, some people might just kind of randomly flip out on you and just, I never want to talk to you again, and leave. But then after they leave, you realize like kind of how toxic that person was and how much you didn't really need them around because they were violating your boundaries. So this will, if you're experiencing things like this, work with this rune and you're going to start noticing things get shaken up and cleared up. And it can be a very destructive process, but that destruction serves a purpose.
Yes, you're clearing space of the old that's no longer serving, so that you can bring in new things that are conducive to forward evolution as well. And I also wanted to mention this that I find really interesting. So Thurisaz relates to the god of Thor, which in the Norse mythology was the god of thunder, and again Thunar. So I just find it interesting that Thunar was the god of boundaries and of thunder and lightning. Well, if from a scientific perspective, it is the electromagnetic force in the quantum field that actually creates boundaries in the material world that keeps items and objects from going through each other. So I just find it incredibly profound that this so-called primitive race of people somehow knew that this boundary energy was associated with electricity, electromagnetism, when they didn't even have the scientific means to actually discover that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. It goes to show you that, the left brain understanding isn't the only way to understand things. The pagan mindset is really about tapping into nature, observing nature and what's happening there, and then you can glean those lessons from that. You don't need to get
correspondence.
Absolutely.
I'd say that's probably how they discovered that.
Mm-hmm. And our next rune that we have here is Ansuz. So this is the rune. They kind of look similar to an F, except for the two little stops. They go at a downward angle. But this rune actually has quite a few translations or meanings to it. So it can translate to star, mouth, ancestors, the gods. So when we start looking at these, we can start recognizing that it deals with our speech, our ability to communicate. It also deals with our ability to listen, because communication isn't just a one-way thing. It just, for as much as you need to be able to communicate what you want, you need to be able to step back and also listen to what others are communicating. So listening to your ancestors, other members of the tribe. But it's through this divine power of speech that we can become like the gods themselves. We're reminded of our divine origin. So, and speech and spelling, obviously, those are obviously a divine gift, but they're also magic, to spell, spelling, obviously, that's a form of magic. So being able to communicate an idea out there that you want that will actually have an effect on the reality field around you, and how important learning proper mastery of this gift and this tool is.
Right. Because again, as I was mentioning before, in so many of the creation stories, reality, matter, and humanity, so to speak, were spoken into existence. So this is that creative force of speech and sound that's related to the gods. And so, again, if you're looking at this progression, first you have your basic material needs, then you're getting the strength to survive and move forward along day to day. Then you have your sense of self. You now know, okay, I have a body. I'm operating in this reality field, and that over there is not me, and this is me. And then you have Ansuz, where you can not only can you communicate your needs, which is now connecting your consciousness to other people's. Again, like you said, Brian, not only speaking but then listening, and it's a two-way street. But then that's also your ability to communicate with the gods, with the ancestors, and begin actually, gaining that wisdom there as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Would you like to introduce the next one?
Absolutely. So this next one is Raido, which is this one here. It is essentially like an R, but just sort of more pointy looking. And this can translate multiple ways. So it can mean ride, as in to ride a horse, which has context in this. It can mean right, in right morally, or right correct as opposed to incorrect. So right and wrong in both of those contexts. And then right, R-I-T-E, which is, like where we get right and ritual, ritual there.
Mm-hmm.
So in the ride context, essentially it's about walking the right path. You're riding your orlog, or your particular sort of the way you're navigating through life. You're riding your intuition, you're riding your knowledge, and by doing so, you will be on the right path, both morally and through natural law, correct versus incorrect, where improper action will take you off the path. So you can kind of look at that, and then what do we do ritual for to ensure that we are staying on the right path? So all three of those very much connect very nicely together, I think.
Yeah, right, you all.
Yes, right you are, sir.
It's definitely a very interesting rune to look at, and it very much steps into the next rune, as Logan was mentioning, how these all build off of each other and tie together. And the next rune is Kennaz, and this can translate as torch or knowledge, which is really how I like to look at it. But it's knowledge with three connotations. The first is that you have the actual intellect and the intellectual knowledge, the left brain understanding of it. The second is that you have the ability, and the third is that you have the right, the Raido. So, for example, if you were wanting to
like a gun,
operate a gun, exactly. You have the knowledge of how to operate that gun safely. You have the ability to do that, and then you also have the right to know how to use that tool in right action without violating other people, violating their Thurisaz, their boundaries, and all these different things. So, as we can see, this wasn't just some alphabet stolen from the Latin and Greeks. This is a system that has a purpose for initiating people into being true human beings. Only looking at it from, this was just something we wrote with. really, to me, it's very disrespectful, not really honoring our ancestors and the true wisdom they really possessed. They weren't just barbarians that had to steal all their ideas from these Romans and people more advanced than them. That's totally not the case, and that's how they're being portrayed, because people, the ones in control of things, do not want this knowledge to be discovered. Because when we can start learning how to initiate people back into a tribe, they will start to get that proper Kennaz, and that's what they don't want you to fucking have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that perspective of just a simple language system or something like that, it to me strikes me as a very Western, left brain sort of way of looking at it there. So I love this, one of my favorites as well. I love that threefold meaning to it. I like to call it the Kennaz et toi. There's 3 layers to it. And I recently learned this from a friend that I thought was really interesting. So in law, when you're constituting a crime, or the stipulations or what's the word? Not requirements, but qualifications, I guess, of a crime, there's the same threefold aspect to it, where does the person have the ability to do the alleged crime? Do they have the mental sanity or knowledge of their actions in order to be culpable for that crime? And then was there loss, harm, or damage, which would constitute the measurement of the morality of the thing? So there you have the ability, the principle of mentalism, and then the actual right action or wrong action. And again, like I said in a previous episode, when you do a wrong, you are committing a crime, because once it's done, it's moved from the realm of potential into the singularity and then cannot be undone. So you have committed to that act. Mm-hmm. So I just thought that was an interesting thing, that even the court system and the law, I mean, that's very much a realm of black magic all in of itself, is the word fuckery that goes on with Black's Law Dictionary and all the legalese terminology and stuff like that. Man, that is a rabbit hole you could spend multiple lifetimes going down to.
Mm-hmm. So, it's very interesting to notice that is also reflected in the legal system. So, looking at, as we mentioned before, these are elemental forces of nature. So I find it very interesting that they then picked up on that, and then what do? They twist and invert things, to put them out there. So then they're using that as a way of actually doing that. But at the same time, recognizing that this is a universal truth and understanding that you can discover, that knowledge isn't just this singular thing, that we actually need to look at it through this threefold context.
Mm-hmm. And so many people these days, particularly keyboard warriors and such, are very much that left brain intellect form of knowledge, but the other two are nowhere to be seen. So it's very important to be looking at that sort of a holographic perspective there, if you will. So So the next rune that we'd like to introduce here in order is Gebo, which is this one. It just basically looks like an X, or like 2 sticks crossing each other. So you could look at it as 2 streams of energy from 2 different participants that is going in a dual direction. And much that indicates, it represents energy exchange. Gebo, you could see this is where we get the word give or gib. Gebo, give, similar sound there. And it's essentially this, it's a natural law. It's not a hermetic principle, but this is one of those examples of how you can see the Germanic people had a very deep understanding of natural law, and they weren't hermeticists or anything like that. So again, if truth is truth, there's so many different ways to arrive at that, because it comes from nature, and only those who are observing and learning from nature are going to really get that wisdom. So, and
that's where pagans look.
So again, on this timeline, we started with Fehu, where you're getting your basic need, but think about a baby. A baby doesn't really give a whole lot back. He's sort of relying on the love of his mother to be selfless herself and just give and give and give to this baby without really getting a whole lot back. I mean, of course, naturally, she gets the joy of being a mother, and I'm not diminishing that, but I'm just saying in terms of the material give and take, babies are pretty much just like resource sponges, you know, and it takes a while before they start being able to reciprocate more in that way. So you can just look at it like, as you're moving through that progression and you're becoming more mature and actualized individual, you need to also learn to understand that give and take has to be there, or else you're going to short yourself, or other people will start to resent you for being a mooch or something like that. Or you give too much, they just see you as somebody to be taken advantage of. And there's nothing spiritual or enlightened about that either. This is where Thurisaz comes in, and this is why Thurisaz comes before Gebo, because you must learn those boundaries as well in both directions.
Absolutely. And, you know, with Gebo, I think there's a couple, you know, things that are very interesting to look at. And one being that we could very much relate Gebo to the law of correspondence. Mm-hmm. You know, that has, you know, what we have within will also be reflected without, because, you know, we're taking, you know, things in, we have this, but then we're also putting them back out there. So, you know, a rune that, you know, the connection between those two is very interesting to observe. But I think it's also, you know, interesting that even with, you know, like the example of the child, you know, at first, as they go through their life, you know, there may come a point where they need to actually then take care of their parents, because their parents become elderly and things. So this, you know, this is a give back and forth that can play out in many different ways. But when we see that there needs to be equal energy exchange in nature, and we've talked about this before, what kind of relationship does that constitute? It's a symbiotic relationship. When you have a relationship where only one is giving and the other one is only taking, that's a parasitic relationship, and it's unhealthy and out of alignment with natural law. So moving on to the next rune after we see here, you'll see why understanding to being able to have that symbiotic relationship is absolutely essential before you can then move on to the next rune, which is Wunjo, and start to master that.
Right. And just as one quick little thing I wanted to add to Gebo too, is this, to me, this is striking me as a great example of how when we talk about natural law, especially when you say natural instead of cosmic or something like that, people always just think of observing animals. And in a way, there are aspects where that is both a truth and a falsehood. It depends. So what we're saying here is that if you're observing nature, symbiosis is in effect, and also some beings are parasitic, and both are in play. And by observing this as being a more conscious, a person with more higher cognitive abilities, you're able to recognize those patterns and say, oh, look, this is in harmony with the ecosystem, and it's a give and take, versus this, like a leech or a tick or some other type of parasite, that being doesn't contribute anything. So that would, you know, I just wanted to point out there that by observing nature, we can, there's the positive and the apophatic aspect of natural law. You can observe these different creatures and say, this over here is good for them and everyone else. This thing over here, I don't want to be like that, because they're only looking out for themselves at the detriment of their environment. Right.
And then moving into the eighth rune of the Elder Futhark here, so the last rune of the first 8, we have the rune Wunjo, and this translates to joy. But it's joy that comes from being with your family and your friends, being a member of the tribe. So having that tribal connection that human beings are seeking, because, you know, we are social creatures, and, you know, I think a lot of people, maybe even in the freedom or the anarchy community, get very, you know, they, as we talked about in our black and white episode, they might swing all the way towards, you know, being only individualistic. But really, when we look at our nature and what we need, we all need someone else. Like if you were a child born and you didn't have someone to take care of you, you wouldn't have made it. So we are social creatures. And there is a great joy to be had in having that kind of authentic connection. But to be able to do that, you need to be able to understand equal exchange of both give and take. You need to be able to understand proper knowledge, and to be able to have communication and boundaries and strength, and all these other previous runes that we talked about all of those need to be mastered in order for you to really fully step into that place of Wunjo, of joy, of being a functional member of the tribe.
Right. And you could also sort of relate this to fun as well. If you're pronouncing Wunjo like with the Germanic accent, Wunjo, fun, because again, it's reminding you of that aspect of existence that, again, we kind of talked about in our previous episode about doom and gloom, how if you're focusing too much on a certain thing and you're not looking at what you can do to cultivate abundance in your own life, regardless of the world situation or whatever like that, then you're not only cutting yourself off from the material abundance of the first 8 runes, but the Wunjo that you earn at the end of that road, where you've made it, you've mastered all these first 8, and now you get to enjoy being a person in society, interacting with your friends and family, and just enjoying this experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that, to, kind of speak on it, from my experience here, I noticed before I found my ancestral tradition, I was kind of stuck in some of those conspiracy circles and that really kind of the early stages of awakening. A lot of the times people, and we talked about this in our last episode, doom and gloom, people can get trapped to where when they rob themselves of this joy of actually being a functioning member of a tribe, of a family. Like they'll, become so angry or so dogmatic that they actually push their friends and family away. And then that robs them of that Wunjo, of that joy of really being a functional member. So I think that this is such a great rune to work with as a way of even recognizing that even if your family member or your friend doesn't agree with you or see exactly where you are, there's still so much joy to be had beyond that. You don't have to, get out of that left brain intellect and get based, more into the heart-based intelligence and recognizing that you don't have to agree with someone 100%, in order to be a functional member of the tribe or things like that. You just need to be able to enjoy those social connections and be just be a functional member of something else that's larger than yourself.
Right on. Yeah, this actually hit me right here. So as I was introducing in the beginning of this video, the 3 selves, the 3 layers of the selves in the Norse tradition was known as Odin, Vili, and Ve. So Odin is the higher self, Vili is the lower self, and again, think about the chakras. You have the top 3, the bottom 3, and then Ve would be the heart center, where again the higher and the lower conjoin and sort of converge there. So in this first 8, these would be the runes that relate to the Vili. So again, if you want to look at like Vili, sounds like belly. The lower 3 chakras are to do with groundedness, material things, sexuality, all those sort of things. And then when you have that Wunjo, what do? You belly laugh, you Vili laugh. That's that Wunjo of just like complete, like kind of being filled with that joy and that bliss. And usually you do that when you're with friends and family, that you get each other and you're all just vibing. And that's just something that hit me, is the Vili belly connection, and then that belly laugh being the Wunjo.
Yeah. So that, that's just a brief, like I said, we wanted to do just a brief introduction into the runes, since there's something that we mention and talk about in a lot of our videos. So that way this gives you a place to start and a jumping off point to continue to research, as we always encourage people to do. So if you did enjoy this, make sure, take a second to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you'll get to see when we put out new videos every week. And if you felt compelled, like this was useful information, please give it a share as well.
Right on. And so this is going to conclude the first of this 3-part series. In the next 2 episodes in the consecutive weeks, we'll be looking at the second and third sets, which correspond to the mental and psychological aspect, and then the spiritual aspect. And then we'll most likely end up doing other videos in the future, breaking down some, aspects of looking at runes as combinations of different runes, and just kind of trying to get, even deeper in the layers and in the perspectives of all that. But again, this was just intended to just basically introduce these runes, and so hopefully will interest you to continue looking into these things on your own. Again, I highly recommend checking out the Wizard Factory initiation package. It's totally free, and we have some content in there that's dealing with actually working with these runes in a practical and useful way. Also, if you're interested in going more in depth on a personal level, we offer 9 Worlds rune readings as well, where not only are we can look at a certain aspect or situation of your life that you have going on, but then prescribe a specific and personally tailored ritual that you can then use these runes and work with that energy and try to, again, calibrate and sort of balance out those aspects, because it really all does come back to balance in this, the balancing act and spinning plates through life, essentially. So yeah, I think that's going to wrap us up this evening. We hope you enjoyed the content, and we will see you next week for another episode. But of course, until then, be empowered, be inspired, and be encouraged.